Hello, welcome to Sex, History, and Art. In this lecture, we will cover Rome and the Roman Empire down until the middle of the 3rd century. But at the beginning of Rome is a creation myth, one that is steeped in sex. And ironically, it centers on virgins. There were female virgins known as Vestal virgins. They were female priestesses who were required to take an oath of chastity. Violations of that oath were very severe. It usually resulted in death, usually by being buried alive. But the Vestal virgins in this foundation or creation myth of the Roman Empire played a very important role. As priestesses, they also kept public records, and they kept a sacred flame, the eternal flame, burning. But as the story goes, Rome had its founding, its creation, and it centered on a king Numitor of Alba Longa. He had a brother who wanted to be king, so he overthrew his brother. His name was Amulius, and Amulius realized that the king's daughter could potentially have sons that would rightfully inherit the throne. It could be a problem for him. So he forces the King Numitor's daughter, her name was Rhea Silvia, he forces her to become a Vestal virgin. Problem solved. Therefore, she cannot have children. But the problem was she became pregnant. Now, normally that would result in a death penalty. However, she claimed that she was, in fact, still a virgin, but became pregnant by the god Mars. That was her story. So she has a set of twins. They're named Romulus and Remus. So Amulius throws Rhea Silvia into prison and takes the two babies, puts them in a basket, and sets them adrift in the river Tiber. The babies are eventually, they wash ashore and are found by a she-wolf who suckles them. So it's similar to the story of Moses, and it's entirely possible that the Romans could have borrowed that tradition from the Jews. But the two children will grow up and then overthrow their uncle and then reinstate their grandfather to the throne. But they want their own little kingdom. So the two go a little further south of Alba Longa, which today would be around Tuscany. And they found a city on the Tiber surrounded by 7 hills, the city that we call Rome. And as they're constructing the city, they're building defensive walls. And Remus chides Romulus that they're not high enough and that he can in fact jump right over them, which he does. This is how the story goes. And so Romulus killed Remus. Again, sort of like the biblical story of Cain and Abel. So the city takes its name from Romulus. But as the city is seeking out a population, the best that they could do is attract convicts, kind of the lowest of the low in society. And in order to populate, they needed women. There was a neighboring tribe called the Sabines, and they had women. So these Romans decide to throw, I guess you could say, a party, a picnic, a banquet. And they invite the Sabines to dine with them. So they come and they bring their women, and, the Romans are giving them, food and wine, and the Sabines say, well, why aren't you guys drinking? They're, no, we want you guys to have all the fun, So what happens is that they get the Sabines very, very drunk, and then they make off with their women. So when the Sabines sober up, their wives have been essentially kidnapped. So when they come back to fight these Romans to get their women back, these women step between the men and say, please stop fighting, we rather like our new Roman husbands and we're going to stay with them. So that's the story of how Rome came to be a city and came to be populated. It involved virgins and impregnations by gods and rapes and things like that. The episode is known as the Rape of the Sabine Women. The sexual history of Rome is heavily influenced by later Christian interpretation, and even contemporary to the Romans interpretation of their sexual practices often had a political angle to it. So the records are really all we have, and so we have to kind of go by them, but sometimes you have to take things with a grain of salt as well. So we'll talk about the Christians in another lecture. But for Rome, as it becomes this growing city and starts to extend its influence beyond its borders, sexuality in Rome is very much tied to social class. It's tied to politics, to religion, and really to the civilization aspects of the empire itself. It becomes a very important part of how the Romans see themselves. And we'll explain that in some more detail as we go along. But in addition, sex is, in the ancient world, very mysterious. I mean, much of sex and procreation and all that was very mysterious up until only recently. So it lent itself to appeals to magic and potions and things like that. So we'll see a bit of that as well. But also it becomes fodder for plays, for literature. The sexual comedies in the plays of Plautus, the erotic poetry of Ovid. There are religious festivals of Lupercalia and Floralia in which they have fertility rites and nude dancing, things like that. And even their gods, whom they worship in some of these festivals, are very sexual. There's Venus, the goddess of love. There's Priapus, generally seen with a giant phallus. Phallic symbols are very common, as are votive offerings. These are symbols that would be presented at some sort of temple, which included phallic symbols, plaster casts or carvings of breasts, uterus, all kinds of things that they would do. There were also aphrodisiacs, potions concocted to increase arousal. There were contraceptives. A lot of this we would recognize today. In other words, some of the basic principles we would recognize. Before Viagra, there were these potions. But for contraception, the single best contraceptive was abstinence, simply not having sex, or coitus interruptus, which is pulling out before it's finished. There's anal sex. Olive oil actually acts as a spermicide. They could also use sponges as a sort of a diaphragm. And they also had recipes for contraception that would be vaginally inserted that often involved the excrement of some animal, whether it be a crocodile, a mouse, elephant dung, all kinds of things that we would probably be repulsed by. There were also abortive fashions. If a woman became pregnant, there were methods by which she could try to abort the baby. There were also differences in sex when it came to sex for pleasure, sex for love, sex for procreation. All of those had very different aspects in Roman society. The whole notion of semen has its own mini narrative. Too much release was thought to weaken a man. Of course, young boys, as they mature, might have nocturnal emissions. So there were lots of questions and theories and concoctions and so on around those things. There were books written about it. Lucretius De Rerum Natura, which means on the nature of things, tried to explain sex from a more philosophical perspective, from, I guess you would say, the Epicurean view of Greek philosophy, that sex was for pleasure, and on genetics, it depended on whose seed was dominant for the physical characteristics of the child. The Stoics were about controlling the passions, so sex would be good, but it should be affection more than pleasure. And they believed in the equal, at least as far as sex went, that men and women were equal in sex. But for Rome, there's a public and a private aspect to sex. The public face of it had to be one of virtue. But in private, you could engage in vice. Rape is illegal. However, the Romans had a bit of a different definition of rape than we do. A woman could legally bring a charge of rape in a court of law. However, slaves and prostitutes couldn't be raped. It's not that it was illegal, it's just that the Romans didn't call that rape. If, of course, they were your own. So, for example, if you raped someone else's slave, charges could be brought, but only as a property violation, not really for the act of actual rape. Adultery is allowed sometimes, and it all, again, depends on how it is defined. Other times it's prohibited. A married woman could not engage in adultery at all. And a single woman may not be able to engage in sex with a married man if she was a free citizen. However, a married man who had sex with a slave or a prostitute, it was not considered adultery. Male nudity isn't the same as it was for the Greeks. I mean, we see the sculptures and we see, nudity, but we also see for the Romans the toga. The toga was really a status symbol. So the Greeks had a different view of male nudity than did the Romans. And in sex, men must take the dominant role. And again, too much of it was somewhat frowned upon because there would be too much release of semen. It was thought that it would weaken the men. Homosexuality is prevalent, but they don't practice it in the same way that the Greeks do. There's really not the tradition of pederasty that we saw with the Greeks. And it's actually prohibited in the military, although enforcing that is another story. But generally it was prohibited in the military. Later on, with the rise of Christianity, homosexuality is frowned upon, and then by the early Middle Ages, it simply becomes illegal. Roman women had more rights than Greek women. They could own property. They could initiate divorce. They could bring a variety of legal charges. They were citizens of Rome, so they were entitled. They could not vote or hold public office, and they had to be under some kind of legal guardianship, whether it be from their father, their husband, or some other male legal guardian. But for the most part, they were free to move about. The tradition of Vestal Virgins continued into the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. The Christians will finally abolish or dissolve the order in the 4th century. But up until that point, I had mentioned that the Vestal Virgins are charged with keeping this eternal flame, but they also kept public records, and they were expected to maintain their virginity. Normally, a young girl would be chosen around the age of 7 to 10 to become a virgin. Of course, you had to be a member of a respected family. And then she was expected to keep that vow of chastity until around the age of 35, what was thought to be beyond childbearing years. And then she could either leave the order and have as much sex as she wanted, or she could stay. Some did, some didn't. Women also wore a considerable amount of makeup. They wore a lot of jewelry. They got their hair done in the latest trendy styles, and the portrait busts of Roman women attest to this. We can see all of these different hairstyles. They dyed their hair. They wore wigs. So public sexuality for them certainly had something to do with their appearance. And since they had more rights than Greek women, it becomes a larger part of Roman society itself. So now let's talk a little bit about the sort of general history of Rome, the Roman Republic, and then the Roman Empire. Rome had begun to spread its influence outside the city fairly early in its history, maybe around 500 BC or so. It starts to become more powerful. But after the Greeks, or after Alexander the Great dies, the Greek influence begins to wane. And in its place is the city in North Africa known as Carthage. And they have an empire that is largely built on trade. They were excellent shipbuilders and navigators, and they had maintained this trading network and this, sphere of influence. And Rome wanted it. So there are a series of 3 wars over a couple of centuries between Rome and Carthage. They're known as the Punic Wars, for the Roman name for the Carthaginians, which was the Punici. Rome will win all 3 of these wars, and by the 2nd century BC, they basically take over all of the territory once controlled by Carthage. And that territory included some very fertile land in northern Africa, mainly around the delta of the Nile River, which becomes the breadbasket of the Roman, or one of the breadbaskets of the Roman Empire. But their expansion did not stop there. It's a kind of mutually reinforcing power, because the bigger you get, the bigger you can get. So Rome begins to spread even further into Northern Europe, into Eastern Europe, kind of wherever they could, they did. In Rome, it became a challenge to govern a large territory, and then you also have the city of Rome itself, which is becoming itself very, very large. In its height, there's 1 million people living in Rome, which in the ancient world is really incredible. And you have different factions vying for power, But Rome was a republic. A republic is where the people voting, people who could vote, which were mainly men who were free, would vote for representatives who would then make law. So you would try to vote for the right people. And those people were senators, and there's a whole series of public offices that these citizens could vote for. So Rome is a republic, but it's always got tension between social classes and enforcing laws and so on. So there's always a lot of domestic and then what we might call international problems to deal with. Julius Caesar, the famous Julius Caesar, in the 1st century BC, will consolidate his power. Initially, he rules with 2 other people known as the First Triumvirate, Pompey and Crassus. But eventually, they both die, and there's some civil wars. I don't want to get into too much of the details, but there's some civil wars, and out of that, Julius Caesar emerges as the sort of lone, you might say, ruler of what is becoming this Roman Empire, although it's still a republic. He initiates a lot of reforms. He reforms the tax system, he reforms the calendar, and the Julian calendar will remain in effect until, I think, the 17th century. It was replaced by the Gregorian calendar, the one that we use today. He drains lands, the marsh lands, for public use, for as a reward for soldiers. He does a lot of things, but he's also into power. He exercises absolute power by naming himself dictator, and then ultimately dictator for life. And so in 44 BC, as the story goes, he is assassinated, and power then falls to his great nephew, a man named Gaius Octavius, who will then take the name Octavius Caesar. We will come to know him as Augustus Caesar. He too will rule in a triumvirate with Mark Antony and a man named Lepidus. But Antony and Augustus are really, each of them want power. They kind of divide the empire up between the two of them, but each wants to do away with the other. And so eventually Augustus will defeat Mark Antony and his queen, Cleopatra. Cleopatra was the consort, or mistress, I guess you might say, of Julius Caesar. She actually bore him a son. But after Caesar's death, Mark Antony takes over the eastern part of the Roman Empire, which included Egypt, and he hooks up with Cleopatra, and their love affair is very well known. Of course, her love affair with Caesar was well known. When she introduces herself to him, she has a fancy rug presented to Caesar as a gift, and when he unrolls the rug, there is Cleopatra nude inside the rug, awaiting him. So those sexual stories become part of the political narrative. But once Augustus consolidates his power and rules on his own, that's really the point at which we refer to Rome as an empire rather than a republic. It's still nominally a republic, and it sort of functions as one, but for the most part, Augustus has considerable power, so we refer to it as the Roman Empire, and he has this title of emperor. But shortly after Julius Caesar is assassinated, the Senate will deify him. They will basically worship Julius Caesar as a god. And this will start something known as the cult of the emperor, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. But Augustus has some problems to deal with. The empire continues to expand under his rule, which goes from around 44 BC until about 14 AD. But he's really not firmly in control. Sometimes you'll see a date of 31 BC when he defeats Mark Antony, 423 BC, which is when he was able to convene the Senate at will. And sort of once he can convene the Senate at will, that's really when the Roman Empire, or the Roman Republic, ended. But there was a problem with population. The people weren't having enough babies, and so he decrees that people had to get married, and they had to have kids, and adultery becomes illegal, and these are known as Augustus's marriage laws. Sometimes they're also referred to as the moral laws, because he legislated a lot of morality. Well, as it turns out, his own daughter Julia runs afoul of these laws, and to be consistent, he banishes her, even though he himself is a notorious philanderer. You know, I guess he who makes the rules doesn't have to abide by them. But for Rome under Augustus, it has really become this very, very large, powerful, centrally controlled empire. But in its governance, everything is done in what's known as the Roman Forum. It's a physical space, an outside space, in which there are government buildings, there are temples, there are triumphal arches, there's entertainments, theaters, you name it. Business, politics, pleasure, all gets done in the Roman Forum. Rome was a very outdoor culture. Given the weather, I guess we could understand why. But in addition, when you have those large cities, you want to make sure, or you have to make sure, that you have the one thing everybody needs, which is water. You could not take water from the Tiber because everybody dumped their raw sewage into it. So the Romans came up with a system of aqueducts where they would find clean sources of water, and they would essentially build a highway or a sort of, I guess you might call it a canal. It's just not used for transportation of people, just of water. These aqueducts would just bring water into the cities. They were very elaborate, and they were very innovative, and they were all over the place. So not only do they have fresh water, but they use their supply of water to create these other public buildings known as the baths, the Roman baths. So the Romans were very much a very clean society. They had clean water, and they maintained a level of cleanliness with the baths. But the baths themselves were a place where religion and politics got done. Sometimes men and women were separated, other times they weren't, and of course everyone bathed in the nude, so there were certainly Roman orgies that would take place. And of course orgies are a big part of Roman history, and most of the Roman emperors will engage in them. And of course these public buildings often were built by an emperor and would have their name attached to them. After Augustus dies, and I'll go through just a series of emperors, and I'll just mention a few things about them before we close out the lecture. The emperor who followed Augustus was Tiberius. He was not his first choice. He was the one who was kind of left standing after his other choices had died. And Tiberius really didn't want to be emperor, and in fact he mostly retreats to his island retreat at Capri, where he indulges in all manner of sexual depravity. If you read about Tiberius, it's striking to us, or we would regard it with horror. He has many, many young boys and girls whom he engages in sex with, has them have sex with each other. It's very, very depraved. But he doesn't really rule Rome from Rome. He sort of rules everything from Capri, and he's more into his sexual depravity than he is in ruling Rome. He also has a child of one of Augustus's chosen successors, Germanicus. he was a boy when Germanicus was poisoned, and his parents loved dressing him up in Roman military gear, including these little boots, which were known as caligares. So he got a nickname, Caligula, which meant little boots. And Tiberius had basically killed his entire family, but he kept Caligula alive, and it exposes him to all of this depravity. And people, there's I think 1,000-foot cliffs on Capri, so anybody who ran afoul of Tiberius was simply thrown off of the cliffs. And of course, Caligula is watching all this as he grows up. When Tiberius dies, Rome rejoices because he was rather tyrannical. And when Caligula comes to power, people were pretty happy because he ended these treason trials, and people thought, okay, this is going to be good. But very soon afterward, Caligula developed what's thought to be encephalitis, and he almost died. And after this recovery, he becomes kind of crazy. And so the stories about Caligula are probably the most legendary. He apparently had sex with his sister Drusilla. He would visit some aristocrat's home, kind of unannounced, invite himself for dinner. He would then seduce the man's wife, take her into a bedroom, then come back and report to everyone how good or she wasn't in bed. I mean, this is pretty crazy. Eventually, Caligula is assassinated. He's replaced by Claudius, who had married his own niece, who will eventually poison him so that her stepson Nero can become emperor, and he does. Nero enjoyed the company of men and women, and eventually he'll be assassinated. Then there are a succession of 3 quick emperors until the Romans are having some problems with the Jews in Jerusalem, and the man who is putting down that rebellion is a man named Vespasian. And Vespasian, hears about all this turmoil in Rome, and so he decides he's going to become emperor, so he marches back to Rome and becomes emperor. And at least at this point, the sort of sexual depravity as part of being a Roman emperor kind of subsides for a while. Vespasian was a very effective ruler, as was his son Titus, who followed him, and then followed by his other son, Domitian, who was a bit more of a tyrant, and he's assassinated. Following that is the rule of Trajan. And it's at the time of Trajan's emperor, or when he's emperor, he's the first non-Italian to be emperor of Rome. But also, he's from Spain. But it's also the point at which the Roman Empire is at its greatest extent. After Trajan, at the end of, or the beginning, really the end of the 1st century, beginning of the 2nd century, that's when Rome is at its height. But Trajan was mostly homosexual, although, as I said, the sort of sexual exploits of the emperors settles down for a little while. I'm not going to do this in strict order. I've skipped a couple of emperors, so I'm just going to kind of hit the highlights, so to speak. After Trajan, he's followed by Hadrian, and Hadrian travels all around the empire. He visits the empire more than any other emperor, and he's also homosexual. He has his lover Antinous, who will drown in the Nile, and then he will deify Antinous and worship him, and insist that all Romans worship him as a god. Following Hadrian is Marcus Aurelius, and it's thought that at the end of Marcus Aurelius, he was a Stoic, so he was very much into controlling the passions. At the end of his reign, it's thought that what was known as the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, had come to an end. And after this, things get very, very chaotic for the Roman Empire. You have the Severan dynasty, a series of emperors from Septimius Severus down through Caracalla, who are not very effective in ruling an empire. They're more into themselves. In the aftermath of this, there's something known as the crisis of the 3rd century. In a period of 33 years, there will be 14 different emperors, and only 2 of them will die of natural causes. So the Roman, I'm kind of skipping a lot of stuff here, I know that, but what's happened to the Rome of Augustus, which was very centrally controlled and well organized, 200 plus years later, the wheels are starting to come off, and the Roman Empire is really starting to teeter. And from this point, another emperor will come to try and right the ship, and that's where we will pick up the lecture the next time. We'll look at the Emperor Diocletian, and then we'll follow that down until the end of the Roman Empire in 476. Thank you.